Thank you for being here for another one of my musings. Today we're going to talk about the collective consciousness architecture. The topics we're going to cover today will be ecology and ecosystems and how they work, neural networks, a little neuroscience, integrated information theory, dependent origination in Indra's net, Brahma's timing and levels of Vak, and a personal synchronicity of mind. I understand that some of this stuff, even if I tell you what topics I'm covering, it might not really ring a bell, but I will go into defining all of these. And also for the next couple of lectures, based on some feedback I got, I'm going to try to release shorter videos in uh, more like a higher frequency. And I try to make this one short, but it might be just as long as some of the other ones. I don't know. Let's see. Why define an ecology? So, in our last lecture, I talked about music kind of being that concluding note, no pun intended, on how it is like that the method with which we can bring the unmanifest to manifest and create an experiential aspect of math and science at like another level. So I felt that the best way to work with it was to start beginning an experimental stage. And I got an intuitive nudge to kind of take a pause on that. And for some reason, my brain went down this route. So this is what we're talking about today. And I will explain everything and how it all comes together. But before we do things experimentally, it's important to define the problem thoroughly. And what I wanted to solve for with reality-based disorders was symptoms of a larger problem, cosmologically speaking. And the larger problem is a system, and the system needs to be well defined. And I want to make sure I leave no stone left unturned. I'm super razor sharp about why I'm doing everything. Um, I started off with talking about collective consciousness, and that can include all living things on this planet. So it is just specific to Earth and specific to human beings because the problems we're trying to solve for are for human beings, though every living thing is included. So an ecology is, or ecology in general, is studying relationships between organisms and their environment. And an ecosystem is a complex network or interconnected system. So the ecology for social interactions already exists, where it's just relationships between humans and their environments, and it can include political philosophy and social critique. But I mean, we have global issues, so it's important to think about multiple social ecologies that can exist all around the world. And if we take it a step further, we could define that as one large global society, all human beings, right? It's the sum of all humans, which means sum of all human consciousness. So you could call that a collective and kind of just say, you could link global society to being collective consciousness, not of the entire cosmos. Again, just talking about human beings here. Our collective consciousness can both be defined as an ecosystem and be studied with an ecological lens so that we can find ways to measure and observe agents within and the relationships in between and how they interact. So both are important. So how would we want to look at defining collective consciousness as an ecosystem? In my mind, I've always, hold on, I also even have like some artwork here I made like 6 years ago. It was a really crazy dream that was very profound and very lucid and very existential about there being a grid that we're all pulled from. And I'll get into my own personal insights in a few lectures down the road, but that's how I've always envisioned it. Of course, there's likely, more complexity to it, but for all intents and purposes, the idea of like something that's a graph and can morph into different shapes is what makes the most sense. But it would explain connections, right, between nodes and vertices and edges, signal flow distortion, attractor basins. I talked about that as well, where like you can be like a little signal for things in your consciousness to be filtered in your reality, and you could shift that based on what type of attractor basin you are. And I'm sure this grid geometry is far more complex, but at least for all intents and purposes today, it will help us get through what we need to talk about. So when we look at qualities of ecosystems and what they might entail, easy thing to think about is like the base case, homeostasis or harmony. And I mean, I don't know if I can totally say this is all perfectly aligned. I'm sure you guys are very aware of world events, but you could say it's political diplomacy, international resource exchange happening in general, and people around the world getting along, peaceful education. Then there's response to stimuli that we have, and I we would really want to make a case for the ecosystem because I think we spend a lot of time talking about the collective consciousness. Consciousness is everywhere. And until we define a structure, and I know that it might be difficult to say with something so dynamic, how could you do that? Well, we need to start somewhere, and then we can say that it's something super dynamic and nonlinear, because this, unfortunately, like consciousness being the underpinning of everything, is not taken as seriously as I would like for it to be. So if we can see how it shows up, like in homeostasis, right? It's still a system. I mean, you could even say it functions as its own living organism. But we do have response to stimuli as a collective. When there's tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, we have disaster relief. When COVID hit and the way the response team stepped in, we have protests and activism. There's also negative responses to like virality on social media. There's misinformation. There can be riots. All right, and organization, we have two within our ecosystem. We have government, housing, education, family structures, ways we go about traveling and interacting internationally, agriculture, healthcare. We also evolve in, I mean, upwards and maybe downwards. Is that devolve? Well, we have education and parenting, innovation, art, and the growth of the population that contributes to that. And of course, if we're talking about what ecosystems have qualities of, then we can also talk about where there's failure, which is why I find it important to create a structure like this. So, like I said, I'm seeing it as a grid. And one of the things that comes to mind is overworked nodes. So there's like, if there's a graph, there's a current node over here, you have the surrounding pieces, and let's say this current one is parasitic, meaning it's always taking and draining resources, but it's not giving back. So there's no reciprocity. And so the nodes around it, in an attempt to help, overextend themselves. And in that process, they kind of like lose their essence. They lose their ability to be worker nodes in this collective consciousness grid, considering that everything is interconnected, so it can kind of start spreading around everywhere, right? And those nodes are connected to their own like neighboring nodes. Those guys also get affected by this. So, be again, like this can, if you really took it hypothetically, like as a thought experiment, super far, you could hurt the entire collective this way when there's one parasitic node and causing all these overworked nodes. Cycles. That's the first thing that came to mind is we see that in society today, everything is a reaction. Um, Now, I mean, people debate whether they can work within the system and try to change it from within. I am a proponent for out creation. It just helps a lot more because there's less proving your worth you have to do within a system of sorts. Although one could say you don't fully exit a system as long as you're alive. There's some system going on, but you get what I mean. But like, I would call this an ecological dead zone of consciousness, right? Like, you're just going back and forth. Nothing's really happening. And everything is happening in response to something else rather than coming from a place of like complete alignment and peace. And I have two more things with a caveat to them. So, fragmentation of the grid, what it sounds like, right? Isolation. You have like a node kind of just off away from this grid. There can be a good aspect to this. Someone could go rogue, and that rogue node could be defying norms for the purpose of evolution. So it adds back. I mean, it's not easy to do a predictive analysis of this, but right now I'm just more so going over the general structure I find there to be with parallels, and then we can get more into the nitty-gritty in the next talk. there can be bad isolation, right? When there's extremist ideology that separates you from everybody, there's a lack of empathy that happens because you lose your sense of connectedness because you're fragmented. So you can't, empathy is kind of like that ability to kind of feel yourself and have that compassion for another individual so it can cause harm. That's why the caveat exists. And entropy. I find that the topic of thermodynamics explains the cosmos fairly well, and people really buy into it. And I find that if we want consciousness to have that legitimacy there, seeing the behaviors that you see in physical matter also show up in consciousness, and its systems would likely add a layer of legitimacy because I had kind of this conflict of like, well, entropy is sort of a natural process in the cosmos, and there can be a good and bad for that too. So, for example, a good would be a natural furthering, which results in a multiplicity. We're all one big mind of God consciousness, all one united front, and over time we keep getting broken down and broken down. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It can equate to being a form of richness, but also the bad aspect of it can be a loss of coherence and alignment. It can happen at an individual level, it can happen at a collective level too. And it causes the whole system to just be corrupt and parasitic and kind of eat itself alive and destroy itself, right? Yes, to the point where it can't recover. So, yeah, I mean, this is kind of describing almost like its own biology and it's a living organism. And now with that being said, intelligence comes into play and maybe even the ability to develop a self-awareness because we're not just talking about relationships in the environment in such an isolated sense, but there's information involved here and that adds to the dynamic play. So, in thinking about that with the ecosystem, it made me kind of go into my computer science background brain and think of neural networks. Neural networks, they're algorithms that use graph-like structures of interconnected nodes to learn from data and make predictions similar to the human brain. The process generally looks like there's an input, so there's an initial layer of the neural network. It is responsible for receiving raw data that the network will process, so just data in. Then there's a set of layers that do a bulk of the computation operations. They transform that data through weighted connections and activation functions. There's a little bit of a learning model that's placed in there, and the output is the network's prediction or result, whatever you want that neural network to do. And the process kind of starts over again. It keeps growing and learning because it sees new data, adjusts accordingly, and then comes back in with, more input. And the layers are a little bit more sophisticated. So if we combine the concepts behind neural networks and ecosystems dynamics together for collective consciousness, we could say that collective consciousness can be defined as an ecological neural net where consciousness is both structured like a grid and alive like an ecosystem. The neural net side of information and learning, units and weights. Um, Again, this is like for the next talk, but like individual units and like almost seeing it like as a weighted graph, maybe like a decision making aspect is more likely to go in one direction versus another, or there's a higher likelihood of interacting with the next node versus the other one. Distributed representation, message passing communication that we have. It's also very dynamic. Plasticity and loss. So, plasticity being the ability to adapt and learn and create new connections, and losing data. Generalization. So, having this ability to create an understanding of the world and adapt to it with generalizing. And then we have the ecology side, which has your energy, conversation, and resilience. We have resources and a metabolism in collective consciousness. We have people and their energy, we have their weaknesses, we have their strengths, and then how we metabolize those things and use it to our advantage, how we can do that with mass media as well. Niches and diversity. that can be explained on its own. Interactions and friction, it can look like war, it can look like just simple issues between two people, succession and regime shifts. Anytime there's new learning or somebody has established a great discovery of sorts, then it can shift the way the collective operates and moves. Like you can imagine the simple discovery of television or the iPhone or computers and how that shifts the way the whole collective behaves. Keystone actors and redundancy, we have celebrities, we have scientists, we have people who kind of consistently show up in the light on the news. Typically, we'll see them. That's where we see them. And they're sort of responsible a bit for how people can sort of respond to stimuli, and they're bringing up the stimuli. So I bring both of these up because a pure neural net ignores the calorie scarcity in the habitat. This almost like it's a cyclical like feeding thing that's very alive, right? But if we do pure ecology, it ignores the symbol processing, collective memory, and even the really technical aspect of how collective consciousness behaves. So the hybrid models meaning and metabolism with learning and logistics, which is what human collectives actually do. So this is like the most accurate representation of our behavior. If you're going to talk about diversity, niches, uh, and different states of being, then we ultimately run into talking about what is harmony and what is chaos or disharmony. So it's very difficult, from what I can say today, maybe not in the future, but to do a lot of predictive analysis of how people will act and if you keep put them in harmony, would they stay in harmony and what does that look like? And the definition could always change. So there's always going to be nonlinear behavior in this ecological neural net, which can present complex problems, but also complex solutions. But why am I even bringing this up? In order to do any experimentation for any of the research I'm doing, I have to follow the scientific method. If I'm following the scientific method, that means there's a problem I want to solve. And if there's a problem I want to solve, I have to identify what the problem is. And if I have to identify what the problem is, I need to understand what system it comes from and understand the system itself. And so harmony here is asking, when it comes to consciousness and everyone being alive, can we achieve a unanimous vote on utopia when we increase the multiplicity of consciousness? It's like really easy to think about you and your best friend are nearly going to agree on everything, almost everything. There would still be a little bit of a difference. So you keep adding more people into your friend group, there's more of a chance of disagreement and difference and differentiation. So when we have over 8 billion people on the planet, do we want all of them to agree on one look of what harmony is and only stay at that? Or do we want that diversity? Because both have their pros and cons. So, what if harmony instead is measured by the ability for infinite realities to coexist? And then people can sort of choose their reality as they evolve and change. It doesn't have to be stuck in one way of being where you don't understand anything or know of anything else. Here's a challenge. So we have some people in the world that believe, they're right about something and everybody else is wrong, against what their mindset of how everything in the universe works is. And it usually ends up leading to like, okay, you don't deserve this land, you don't deserve your life, you don't deserve this, you don't deserve that, which can be dangerous if acted upon. The other aspect is we want to have infinite realities on a finite planet. Finite planet meaning we have finite resources, which means we must share these resources. And there can be policies and mindsets put into place that can kind of jumble in these infinite realities and how they can really coexist. So, um, if people are not aware, I am attempting non-dualism and it's super difficult. So let's talk about ethical non-dualism when we're talking about harmony being infinite realities existing together. So, for those who aren't aware, non-dualism just means not two, which means no separateness, and it's the removal of the illusion of separation between subject and object. Basically, again, saying that we are all one, and there's really not like an objective truth, which can get really complicated when people have different ideas of what good and bad would be. So, if we can have ethical non-dualism and a richness of consciousness, it could be the highest measurement of success of that system. And these were some categories of nodes in this little grid I was thinking of, and it's still in progress. I mean, the list could get greater, but what I could sort of think of were, contributive nodes. Like they're unique, eccentric, they can disrupt an industry and disrupt a way of life, but they create new pathways the same as you would in your brain. And there's resilience that they add too, or a new way of thinking. There can be parasitic nodes that take without giving back. And the example I brought up, I'm sure that you guys have met some parasitic nodes in your life. They drain resources, but they aren't destructive. They just kind of suck. Cancerous nodes actively replicating harm, destroying other nodes, collapsing harmony. Think dictators, abusers, psychopaths who prey on others. So the paradox of what we allow to exist in an infinite universe or highly diverse system of collective consciousness would be that, at the absolute non-dualistic level, everything can exist. Everything is considered divine and infinite in Tantra, even shadow and destruction. And I'm a Shaivistic philosopher, so deity being Shiva contains both creation and dissolution. And Shiva also has multiple forms that appeal to dark entities as well. Not to stay there, though. Not to stay there, but to transform. The goal is not to accept horrible things. Just want to make that clear. But at a relative ecological level, to maintain harmony, the system can't let cancerous nodes define the baseline. Um, I mean, there has to be consequences for actions. So they have to be isolated, quarantined. They need to either evolve or be removed. And there are different ways you can remove them. Let your imagination run there. So, furthering the conversation of what that looks like, um, the system as it exists today, like if there's something cancerous, would our system naturally spit it out or destroy it? Is that how we have evolved to become? Well, it seems in our society we have multiple nodes preserving some dark leadership that sets out to harm the collective or feed off of the collective consciousness, like energy, right? We're talking about metabolism here and resources. Um, but yeah, by inciting violence and division, this is why all of this has been developed to begin with. This is why I started YouTube research to inform like what I want to do with actual physical research-based entrepreneurship and experimentation. I mean, it's just as simple as saying I'm really tired of bad guys winning, and I was really tired of feeling helpless and watching things just happen, and there was a lot of discourse on it, but I never really saw a lot of action. I know it starts with me, so it's why I'm here, and it was time to get to the bottom of what's going on. I guess I was so bothered by evil that I was like, okay, we gotta go all the way back to the Big Bang and see where did this go wrong? Like untangle these wires. A cancerous nodes can also self-destruct too if they're not really smart. I mean, there can be evolved versions of them. So let's get into what maybe an immune system for this collective consciousness, ecological neural net. We got to come up with a short term for that. Um, yeah, so disturbances can act like stress tests. So from this angle, actually cancerous nodes could indirectly strengthen the system by forcing adaptation. And it's something I will address in the next talk. Of course, nobody wants to feel like they're a martyr for making the big system better, and they're like, okay, bye. I guess I'm the one who has to go through all of this. So there are layers to it. But when we don't have an emotion about it and we're just looking at a system objectively standalone, non-living things, then we can almost see it having some level of benevolence because there's edge cases that in infinite reality bubbling up can show us that maybe we would not have considered, and therefore we have to create stronger boundaries or stronger discipline. Nothing is lost in this system. All the data is contained in this. Every node's experience contributes to the collective geometry. It's not totally in isolation. The distortions they endure inform the geometry of the whole, shaping how these future nodes self-organize. The collective field remembers all. And over time and the long arc of evolution, the field should require less suffering to grow. Ideally, it should be growing and evolving anyways, but if there's suffering involved, then it would reduce over time. We're more proactive, and you can kind of see that this collective consciousness, big mind on planet Earth, seems to be mimicking the small minds that we have, which are human minds, at the scale I'm talking about, which, does its own form of iterative learning, and that's what neural networks also do. They kind of mimic the way the brain operates. So that's really interesting to see. I would like to bring up also integrated information theory, which I learned about recently. It's super fascinating. I'm bringing this up because when you're talking about an ecological neural net or a neural network ecosystem for collective consciousness, you start thinking of lots of data and integration. And that naturally led me sort of to this path. And so in IIT, consciousness is identical to the level of integration of information within a system. Um, so phi or phi is the level of integration. Okay. So if you have a light switch A and B and they exist independently of each other and one does not affect of the other, then the phi or phi level is zero pretty much. But if switch A alters switch B to some degree and there's maybe dimness to the lights or whatever, then the system is coupled together. There is an impact that one thing has on the other, and therefore there is a level of integration, and therefore, according to IIT, some level of consciousness that system has. So, if a system has a high phi value, it means the parts of the system interact in a way that creates more than the sum of their parts. My caveat here comes from panpsychism because it says that all matter has consciousness. It's just the way you define consciousness. Whereas IIT suggests only systems with integrated information has consciousness. Um, Someone brought up a really interesting question to me. They're religious, and they were like, "I'm so surprised that you're kind of vibing with IIT." I was like, "Why?" And they're like, "Well, I thought you would have felt that there's something out there, not that, consciousness comes from information." And I thought that was a fascinating distinction. I'm so glad he told me this because I do believe everything's conscious and like that. God concept is like the super intelligence of everything that exists and how the information passes through and works together, and it feels like magic. Um, so it led me to think like, okay, well then what is it then? What's that level of consciousness that we call being human, and feeling like there's a soul involved even. And I think it's about a level of sentience and self-awareness, consciousness is I mean there's so many different ways people define it, but there's that experience of the interiority of the cosmos and how it's different for every minuscule thing that exists. And human beings, what makes us a bit different is we have this idea of, like, I say, hi, I'm Shivani. I have a concept of self. I have like ego, id. I have this ability to self-reflect, um, adapt, evolve, change, break down, and I mean it's all really great. But with higher intelligence also comes that sense of separation from other things. But it's not that IIT suggests that consciousness is emergent. It's just that, like, meaning it emerges from, but it's that it is it is equal to the level of how much integration is happening within a system. And I think, we should all think about how everything is truly integrated. We'll circle back to that towards the end of the talk. But, can there really be a phi level that's zero, where one thing truly does not affect anything else? Right now, IIT is limited to the scope of the brain, primarily in studying sleeping, waking, coma, and anesthesia states. I wanted to bring up some stuff I've been reading about with active and silent neurons. Active neurons are just brain cells that are currently firing or transmitting signals. And there's something called a silent neuron, which is a cell that is not actively firing, but maybe performing other vital roles. And there's also something called silent synapses, which has been a cool discovery in neuroscience over the years. Synapses versus neurons. Synapses are just specialized junctions between neurons that allow them to communicate with each other. And synapses that are silent are just silent, but they have the ability to be awakened. That's how neuroscientists or neuroscience researchers know they exist. And there's a great chunk of them in early childhood development as the child learns about the world. And they can exist in adulthood, but there's a lot fewer. And these silent synapses can play a crucial role in neuroplasticity and recovery. You could even, I think there were some things I was reading about too. You can fact check me on this, feel free to, on the potentiality for creating new memories and new pathways as well. Also, if you have PTSD or war veteran, I think there's some work out there where ketamine is integrating a bit with silent synapses as well to help work with recovery of pain. So it's kind of fascinating that that exists, and IIT sort of works with the data from both active and silent neurons. Okay, a few lectures ago, we talked about the vibratory boundaries of you. What are you? Who are you? Is there anything that's not you? And how do we enclose that in our body so we have this identity of like the annamaya I've talked about, which is the physical layer, the layer of consuming, and we have our names, we have our eyes, we have our hair, our smell, how we think, how we feel. And you could dissolve that enough too when you feel super similar to another person. It feels like they're just like you. And especially with non-dualism, if there's no separation between subject and object, there's everything is reflecting back to itself. Then that begs the question of wondering if there's anything that's not you. So if we apply IIT to the brain has a high phi value because billions of neurons are densely integrated and affect each other. But I mean, I'm Shivani and I have to take it to the next level. If we expand as far as we can on this and we're looking at five values for your brain, um, but we also believe that your brain is linked to the collective consciousness. So remember too, I've also talked about how the brain is filtering that universal field of consciousness. Then we might want to play with dissolving the boundaries of who we are a little bit. If my brain is phi rich, it is also embedded in a nervous system, which is in a body, which is in an ecosystem, which is in the biosphere, which is on planet Earth, which is part of the cosmos, right? This may lead us to, if we're thinking about systems, it's about integration, and your brain is part of a system that's part of another system, which is in another system, which is in another system. So that is a lot of integration. Of course, there's a lot of information too. And if you extend that far enough, you would get the cosmos, which is, I would argue, the biggest integrated information system. But there's also a patterning to life as well. You have like these nested like systems, and we also have fractals, which basically show self-similar uh, patterns and geometries repeating at infinite scales. Like you can think of lightning bolts or uh, snowflake patterns, and like when you go zoom in, it shows like another like crystalline form that looks like a snowflake again. So we have both connection to everything and then repetition of geometry in everything that exists in this universe. So if we're talking about neurons in the brain and behavior of things in the human mind, and the macro reflects the micro and vice versa, what could we maybe say about similar nodes and neurons in the cosmos? I'm speaking about the cosmos, but I really wanted to stay specific, for sure too, about collective consciousness of human beings on planet Earth, um, because we have those nodes in the brain, and we could also expand that and say we ourselves make one super node, and you can super duper uberify it with other bigger systems as you go on. But again, sticking to collective consciousness. But when I was learning about silent neurons and silent synapses, and how it can be like a clean slate to create new memories with in the brain, well, I wonder if we think of like the neural network, the ecological neural network of collective consciousness, and of course, like I'm using the word consciousness, right? So it's such a highly integrated informational system. Could it also have its own form of silent neurons? The ability to create new memories? Could it behave like its own superbrain? And what would rewriting in the cosmos look like? What would creation of new data look like if we use the neural network model? What could recovery and neuroplasticity in the collective consciousness field look like? And could we even stretch phi to measure the cosmos's waking and sleeping states? And I'm bringing this up too because IIT is primarily used to like check brain activity and how it operates in those waking and sleeping states. So if we're doing that for the brain, and we're bringing up the phi value there, if we're extending the phi value to the cosmos, can we think about the cosmos as waking and sleeping states like the early universe, etc.? It feels like a little bit of a stretch. But well, in Hindu cosmology, I've also been doing my own deep dive on that. There is the time of Brahma. So at first I was like, could something like this exist? And it actually does in this philosophy across the world. So let's talk about Brahma, the time of Brahma, and cosmic calculations. This will be a brief overview. It's not nearly as in detail. I still have so much to learn too, but what little I've been able to glean, I will share. So I also want to mention Brahma is the part of the Holy Trinity, of creation, preservation, and destruction. Brahma falls into the creation category. So one cosmic cycle is one breath of Brahma, one cosmic inhale and exhale of Brahma. And the waxing of phi, the integration growing, could be considered the waking state of the universe, as galaxies and biospheres and minds appear, and you have higher consciousness or consciousness that's rather self-aware. The waning of it, the integration fading, could be the sleep state. The universe could collapse, it could go stagnant, it could go silent, however it looks. And a day of Brahma is one night and a day of Brahma is one night and one day. And they are both the same value, 4.32 billion years, and one full breath would be 8.64 billion years. And Brahma's full life is 100 of his years, so that would be considered the Mahakalpa. And that's 311.04 trillion years. And at that point comes the Mahapralaya, which is the total dissolution of the universe before a new creation begins. So Brahma's full life is the full life of the entire universe. And the days that happen in between, I have more research to do here, but it's some parts of the cosmos dissolving, some emerging and creating. So the kalpas kind of represent the dynamism of what evolves in the whole cosmos. And then the Mahakalpa is like the final, okay, this is done. The Puranic cosmos breathes many times before the total Mahakalpa. Puranic just means like referring to the Puranas, and Puranas are just like a set of texts and that encompass all of Hindu cosmology that contain writings of sages and seers and gurus, as well as content about temples and different deities and holidays and all that kind of stuff. So there's about 36,000 days and nights across 100 Brahma years. So a lot of inhaling and exhaling. And again, it's considered sleeping and waking up, which to me was sort of blowing my mind that there's something that already exists that talks about this stuff. It was just making these slides were so interesting. It was such a natural flow of like the next information came up, the next information, and it just really fed into each other super well. So. I'm really curious too if you can really push out phi and like extend it to the level of the cosmos, not just the brain. And let's talk about the deity Saraswati and my personal synchronicity I would wanted to bring up. So Saraswati is the goddess of speech, music, wisdom, arts, and intellect. She's also the wife of Brahma. In Hindu cosmology, gods and goddesses are typically paired together based on their functional purposes and how they work together to describe astrophysical and quantum physics phenomena and relationships. So there's usually a reason why a certain deity, like a god or a goddess, or deva or devi, would go together. And Brahma is creation and structuring, differentiation, binding, time sequencing. Saraswati is about articulation and knowledge. And this code makes creation legible. Vak is articulatory power, not just speech. That was a distinction I had to kind of, because Vak really represents levels of speech. If you remember when I talked about, just to recap, the four levels of Vak, and there's Para, which is transcendental, the universal sound. There's even a deity called Nada Brahma that is basically stating the universe is just sound and vibration. And there's four levels and it goes all the way down to Vaikari. Vaikari is expressed speech when we're talking to one another. It's also considered if it's physical, it's what we engage with, but it's also full of lossy data and kind of the most inefficient form of communication. And that was when I had also discussed that, like, way back then, it is said that there was an ability to speak mentally, like, so telecommunication in a sense, and being able to capture the essence of something instead of like having to use 10,000 words to describe one experience because, things can be so nuanced. One word can reflect so many different experiences. So ancient India treats shabd or sound and words as a creative principle, and nama rupa, if you're saying it in Sanskrit, names and forms is how reality shows up. If it isn't distinguished and named, it's not part of the cosmos. And intuitively, we only know of something existing because we give it a name. And if we say it exists, we just created it, right? So that's kind of the idea there. So Saraswati is the medium that codes and times and flows everything. Brahma is the creator and the temporal structure of the whole universe. And Saraswati is and Vak is the compiler that renders that structure. So when I was thinking about Vak, like why that to code everything? Because when I'm thinking of speech, I'm thinking of the alphabet. And I'm like, is that really what it is? You just speak it into existence? But I mean, I guess if you do it at like a smaller level, you are saying, whatever you say creates your reality. So, I mean, I guess if you really expanded it all the way to the universe, then maybe you can create the universe by speaking. But again, like it's not just about words, it's really articulation. It's about coding. And so I was like, well, when I think of coding, I'm thinking computer science and that in like, it's a science and also has lots of math, but the more I dug deeper, it's that science and math are explicit forms of Vak as well. The reason that it was kind of a spooky synchronicity is because, well, I was planning on going full speed into understanding glyphs and hieroglyphs. I mean, I will still go deep into that, but my intuition told me to actually take a break from how to run the experiment with sound and music. on consciousness and to instead focus on this. And I was like, really? Like, because I was reaching a block, which is why it took so long to bring this video out. I was like, man, I mean, I was finally getting to a place where I feel like I can represent the research in a way that's tangible, maybe digestible, and has like a proof of concept. Fingers crossed, maybe. And I was so sad to lose that because I was having a creative block. And usually the way I operate too is like I have I don't know, where is it with me here? So there's literally in my notebook, I go from, this page talking about all the things related to colors and numbers that I want to talk about. And then I move over here. There's some meal prep stuff in there, but I talk about the ecology and ecosystem of consciousness and how that operates because I just could not get past this page. And to find out that the goddess in charge of Vak, responsible for this, is the wife of Brahma, and to feel that I did all of this research only to come full circle to make sure there was no stone left unturned felt like, I guess, the perfect bow on top. I was wondering why my brain was naturally going towards this route. And so it's incredible that like Vak is inseparable from creation and the structure of time and this whole ecosystem of cosmic consciousness that could likely be modeled. I mean, although we will never fully figure out everything, but we can figure out enough, and that's what we want to do. But to see that those two belong together was just such a beautiful blessing to encounter. I mean, I just found that out today, so that was pretty cool. And now I would like to bring back Indra's net and Pratitya Samutpada with integrated information theory, where there's some overlap and where there's some differences. So IIT suggests that there can be such a thing as no interdependence, no consciousness, where phi is valued at zero. But Pratitya Samutpada is a Buddhist philosophy of dependent origination, which just means that nothing arises independently. Everything that exists, everything that arises, exists in relation to something else. Indra's net is that metaphor for interdependence and interconnectedness of a system represented by a network of jewels. And each jewel represents the ability to experience the entire cosmos. This aligns with the holographic theory of the universe, and each slice of a hologram contains the data which allows you to see the full holographic picture. So, I mean, this net is not too far off from the nodes we speak of when we're talking about networks and graphs. It's just the one I'm trying to suggest has a lot more technical complexity so that we can do some physical work with it and move matter on the planet. Otherwise, this just ends up being philosophy and then nothing really happens with it, right? So if IIT logic is extended, the whole cosmos may have its own phi value. That would mean the whole universe is conscious, and not in the human thinking sense, but in the sense that the entire structure of the cosmos is irreducibly interdependent. And where I feel like Eastern philosophy and wisdom and ancient philosophies don't interact with IIT is causality. Because IIT, mind you, is still working with like the brain and systems that exist today, as it should, as it should. It's I think gained a great amount of legitimacy. But when you're thinking about systems, you're thinking about cause and effect. And cause and effect suggest linear time. Like this happened at second one, and as a result, in second two, there was a consequence. So I'm still not sure where this would happen. Where is that line that takes us from linear space-time to nonlinear? And is it possible to achieve in this human lifetime? And the reason I bring up this as a legitimacy of the universe, that it's nonlinear, is one, there's my cultural background, and two, there's also quantum entanglement, the aspect that like there's an instantaneous shift between one particle and another when one develops a value of sorts and the other one gets the opposite value. You can have like a plus and a negative, and in one of the lectures I talked about how would it know that one thing is positive, then this thing is negative, right? Like you have to know this and then you can do that. But no, it's instantaneous and there's connection and distance is not a problem in this thing. And distance is a physical attribute in reality. So quantum entanglement could very well, if you really took it far, could push for some sort of like telecommunication understanding. Yeah, so it doesn't it's not worried about space, it's not worried about time. And yeah, I do wonder how we would be able to capture that level of nonlinearity in a defined system or equation, but that's what this is all about. And it's a follow-up. We can all talk about it in the comments section, but if we can achieve true isolation. Yeah, this makes me think because I mean, quantum systems, quantum information, anything that is like a quanta is isolated on its own. But when we're studying it, we know we're studying it in relation to things that we are not studying. So I guess in that sense, philosophically, it's not in true isolation. And the reason I ask this is, can we really have no interdependence? Can you think of anything in this reality that doesn't exist in relation to something else? Like if I have a water bottle, I know this is a water bottle because it's not this like fluffy llama or like a book. You know, why did I give it this name? Something to think about. So it's really great to see the intersection between not only what people are talking about when it comes to cosmology and consciousness today, but in neuroscience, in complex systems theory, in music, in sound physics. So we have different angles, but we're reaching similar conclusions. So what could be next? Well, information is at the heart of all of this, and how intelligently that data is stored, what format is it is stored in, and what more could be. And it's also about what's most useful to us. Our problems of consciousness today exist within our minds and our societies. And for me specifically, I care about dark consciousness, reality-based disorders, but it was integral to understand how these RBDs are symptomatic of distortions in the cosmic consciousness grid. I think I was maybe my intuition may have pulled me away the way it did was maybe I was isolating the problem a little too much, and I needed to understand where it all was connected. So sound is still at the heart of it all for me. Mind you, I mean, of course, like I left my last lecture talking about music and sound and vibration. But it's important to understand the structure it comes from too, because sound itself is not outside of space-time. It's still linear because it needs a medium and it needs time to travel through. But how we experience sound is in a timeless manner. So as far as what's next, I would like to do a deeper dive of, we talked about nodes like human beings, right? But, it's important to define properties. And, this thing about silent synapses and neurons is really interesting. So I would love to understand how collective memory in this consciousness grid is stored. How does it move? And how does it learn and evolve, but like in a computer science systems design way, just putting that degree to use finally, maybe. But all exciting things. I'm really glad that we got the structural aspect at a basic level sort of out of the way, and this can at least allow for more depth and making sure that there's nothing that's missing before you start getting into a physical sense of experimenting on people because you need to be razor sharp and need to know your why. And I'm saying your, I really mean for me. Well, anyway, I appreciate everybody listening and being here. And yeah, it's just all I can say is there's just no doubt in my mind about how fun this can get and what you can learn. So all hail the mighty cosmos and a toast with some H2O to phenomenal cosmic power. I will see you in the next one.